Welcome to the Grit and Grace podcast, hosted by Tonya-Bruton, a faith-filled journey where we celebrate the resilience of the human spirit intertwined with the grace of God. Here we delve into recovery stories, mental health, relationships, and deep dives into scripture, chapter by chapter and verse by verse. Our mission is clear: to encourage and inspire, equip the saints, and above all, glorify God through testimonies, Bible studies, interviews, and more. Broadcasting from the heart of Truth Seeker Texas Radio in Decatur, Texas. Catch new episodes every Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, with daily replays at 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. Central Standard Time on www.truthseekertexasradio.com. YouTube and Spotify and other major platforms are uploaded on Thursdays. Get ready to be uplifted and empowered. And now, join us for today's episode of the Grit and Grace podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Grit and Grace podcast. I am your host, Tonya-Bruton, and I am so glad that you're here listening today. And I'm glad to bring you a new guest, Mr. Richard Lynch. And just let me tell you a little about him, and then we're going to get into a discussion. He's going to tell us his story today. Richard is a married father of 5. He was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. Hope I said that right. Although his wife is from Michigan, that's become his second home. He's a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor, holds an MA in clinical psychology, also a certified advanced brief counseling specialist, EMDR certified practitioner, a QPR instructor, which is suicide prevention, and is the AD of programming at a 328 bed Department of Corrections substance abuse program. Richard also oversees the program and is the clinical supervisor for the counselors there. He also operates a small private practice doing grief counseling with parents who have lost children to overdoses, and is also a lay minister and has operated Spread the Word since 2016. He's done sick calls, end-of-life visits, and 113 funerals for families who do not have a pastor. My pastor does that as well. All right, welcome to the show, Richard. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Any chance I get to share the glory.
Yes, and I'm excited to get into your story. We'll talk a little bit today about mental health, recovery issues, but mostly we're just going to hear a good old-fashioned testimony of how someone found the Lord Jesus Christ, how Jesus changed someone's life. That's the nuts and bolts of it. So why don't you go ahead and get us started, Richard?
All right. Well, as my bio said, I was raised in Louisville, Kentucky, so you got that right. That's how we know if people are from here or not, how they pronounce it. So you did good. I was born to a 15-year-old mother and a 19-year-old father. So babies raising babies. And I emphasize that only because through my healing journey, that is a part of my perspective, that they were children. And it was not an ideal situation. I would say that I lived in a middle-class neighborhood, and I come from a large Irish Catholic family. I have 13 aunts and uncles collectively, and that Irish Catholic background, we were raised in the Roman Catholic Church. I went to Catholic grade school, high school, college, unintentionally. It wasn't really marketed that way, but that was how I was raised. And I will add this. I did not know Jesus Christ as a Catholic. I did not have a relationship with Christ. I found as a younger man that asking questions or trying to wrestle with my faith, the answer would typically be, that's what we believe. I don't think faith works that way. And then, especially as a younger person, I have questions about this. I need to wrestle with this. And it just really wasn't fostered there. But again, young parents, and my father was the cool guy in high school. He was the football player, didn't go to class, all that stuff. My mom probably thought she hit the jackpot. And what she learned probably shortly after having a child, it was a shotgun wedding, was that my father was an alcoholic. And that played a great deal of a role in our early life, or at least in my early life. Pre-cell phones, someone going on a drinking bender, you would see them when you saw them. There was no way to track them down. You'd call the 3 or 4 bars they frequented, their 2 or 3 friends, or whatever you had access to. And if they were covering for them or said they hadn't seen them, you just waited it out. So that was what happened until I was 11. So I have a sister 3 years younger. It was a struggle at early childhood. My dad didn't keep jobs consistently. My mom was kind of left to run the household, take care of us. And the one thing she really made sure happened was that I got a good education. Paying for that private education was not an easy thing. We were definitely lower class, and I swept Paul. She worked cake booths. We did whatever we could to help with tuition. She worked in a slaughterhouse once, going to work at like 3:45 in the morning to slaughter pigs and put food on the table. So we did what we could. I really didn't know that my house looked any different than other people's until I went to school, though. And I started to see that their dad's picking them up from school. Why is my dad not picking me up? Why is it that my dad looks like that kid's older brother and their parents look like grandparents to me? Like, my grandparents were young, my parents were young. So it was this perception issue. It was like, something's different about my family, is basically the message that I got from that. Well, coming from this lower class background into this middle class private school, kids can be ruthless. They also don't like know-it-alls. And what I found when I went to school was that's where I got my attaboys. That's where I got my accolades. Was things were messed up at home, but I was smart, and teachers rewarded me for that. Well, 2 things happen. It makes other kids despise you a little bit, that it's like, all right, buddy. And then also, it kind of hardwired me to chase success, unfortunately. And I guess there's worse things to chase, but I will kind of emphasize that a little later. I School was easy for me. It was something that I enjoyed. I did my homework before I changed out of my clothes. It was something that was fun to me. I like to learn. If school was free, I'd probably still be doing that. But at about 11 years old, my father got sober for the first time. And while that was, the culmination of a whole lot of things happening and him venturing into sobriety, it was also when he had his first psychotic break. His uncle had committed suicide, and this was an uncle he was very close with. He had asphyxiated himself, ran a garden hose to the cab of his truck, used duct tape, and he was at his friend's. My father was at his best friend's house, and he saw duct tape sitting on a table, and it triggered something. It started this psychotic delusion that he was involved in the death of his uncle, and that this was actually a murder, not a suicide. And it spiraled very fast. It was confusing. I really didn't understand it. I was kind of used to the alcoholism at that point, but this was something different. And I can remember my first visit to a psychiatric hospital, which was after this break. My mother was visiting my father, and we weren't allowed to go on that floor. It was for kind of the more difficult patients, I guess you'd say. And I remember being on the elevator. She gave us some money, go to the cafeteria, watch your sister. And I remember being on the elevator from the cafeteria. My sister was crying, and a nurse, or at this point in life, I guess maybe it could have even been a CNA or anything. But they had scrubs on, looked like a nurse to me. "What's wrong, little girl?" "Well, they won't let us see our daddy." "Well, why not? Where's he at?" "Well, he's on such and such floor." "Oh, baby, you don't want to go see him. He's crazy. Your daddy's crazy." And that was my first introduction into the stigma of mental health in a psychiatric hospital from an employee, that like, "Oh, your dad's got problems and it's not okay. People that have these problems, you shouldn't be around them." And I don't know that necessarily set the stage for anything, but definitely as a mental health professional, it plays a part in why I believe advocacy is so important. So that was the first of many. And what I will tell you is that I watched my father die over and over and over again. Attempt after attempt, he cycled very, very regularly, once or twice a year, every 6 to 9 months or so. He was schizophrenic and bipolar. They would probably have called that schizoaffective today, but that's what he was diagnosed with. And it was scary. It was when he was not well and he was off his medication. There were safety concerns. There were plenty of opportunity or plenty of times where I can recall him either harming our mother, or I had to get between them or something like that to kind of worry about our personal safety. And you know, that perspective of these things were all happening, this alcoholism and all this. I mean, he was a 20-year-old man. He was not my age now, which I'm not that old. I might look it with this gray beard, but 44 is not that old, I promise. And my father was a good man. He was ill. He had an illness that he couldn't control. These were the cards that he was dealt. But the behaviors that came along with that are also unacceptable and damaging and cause some long-lasting problems. I am a trauma survivor. I've suffered just about every kind of an abuse that you can imagine. Not all of that was at the hands of my father, but growing up in a dysfunctional household, it opened the risk factors and the proximity to other people having to help take care of us and things that, unfortunately, that's my story. By the time I was a teenager, I was very angry. I grew about 13 inches between 6th, 7th grade. I didn't have to wear glasses anymore. Joke's on me, they're back. But I was a nerd. I was picked on. I was bullied for being smart and being a know-it-all, and didn't fit in at home, didn't fit in at school. It was kind of a misfit. And then I grew a little bit, and I was tired of being a victim. I was tired of being scared. I was tired of people hurting me. And what I realized is you're going to hurt me anyways. So I'm not afraid of you anymore. And it went from there. I won't focus on it, but I remember getting in a fight with one of the biggest kids in my class, just like the Christmas story. And I was bawling the whole time I was punching this kid, because it was like I'd finally just had enough. And things changed after that. I realized, like, I don't have to be afraid. The worst you can do is hurt me, and you're going to do that anyways, maybe. So I wouldn't say that I looked for fights, but I definitely had a chip on my shoulder as a teenager. I definitely was looking for justice in the world. And I also didn't have much of a relationship with my father. You know, the medications that worked for him were older versions of medications, so they had stout side effects. He was on disability, he couldn't work. Safety issues. If he was off his meds, coworkers, what is going on? This guy can't be here. Just saying things, doesn't matter what, but just saying off the wall things that would alarm people. So he was on disability. That factored into also his self-esteem and how he felt as a man, that he wasn't a provider and that he was not doing his, fatherly, husbandly duties. And those medications with those side effects, he would stop taking them. He would lie, and he would. I always knew when he was off his medication. I knew before anybody, and I felt it in my body. I knew based on the tone of his voice. He had a friendlier, kinder voice that would happen. It had a higher pitch to it, and I would feel it in my stomach. I would feel the tenseness building, and I knew that in about 5 days, it was going to hit the fan. And that was how it went for a long time. By the time I was 16, I didn't live at home. I lived with an aunt and uncle. I had an apartment at 17. I started college at 17. I had a year and a half of college done by the time I went to college. Like, I knew that my education was my way out of this. And, the irony is that those later teenage years, my father was actually doing a lot better. He was a lot more medication compliant. He was definitely a different dad to my sister, who's 3 years younger. And I'm grateful that she has different memories than I do in that regard. But I didn't want anything to do with him. You can't hurt me if I don't let you in. So I'm going to keep you over here in this box, and I don't need you. Until I was 20, and I had my first kid on the way. babies having babies. And all of a sudden, all the stuff I thought I knew in life did matter. I didn't know half of what I thought I knew. And I remember going to my parents' house and telling them. And my mother immediately was like, I knew it. I knew it. And started lecturing a little bit about, you're going to need to do this, you're going to need to do that. And I just remember him having this grin on his face, just ear to ear, just a grin. And I can only describe that as what looked like joy. Like he was genuinely joyous at that he was going to be a grandfather. And something shifted inside of me, probably compassion, probably understanding that like he played the cards he was dealt. He didn't ask for them. We moved forward. We never really dealt with my earlier childhood, the things that I experienced. I dealt with those things off and on in therapy myself, but we just moved forward. My father's my best friend. We did everything together. Grew up in a family that deer hunts. That's the number one thing we did any chance we got. University of Louisville sports. If they had a quarter tossing team, we'd have had tickets. That's what we did. And at this age of my life, I was not only driven, but I was finding success in a career. I studied forensic psychology. That was kind of my emphasis. I worked in corrections, and I ultimately worked my way to the director of one of these correctional facilities. And it was, I kind of had the world by the horns. That's what I thought. I had the plaques, I had the degrees, I had the experiences to back that up. And yeah, that's kind of how that went for me for those years. You know, I've got my family. I have the father I always wanted. I've got all this success that I've found, and life was pretty good. In February of 2006, I was getting divorced. We had gotten married in 2001, so I guess not a long marriage by most standards. We should have never gotten married. In all honesty, having a kid together is not the right reason to get married. But at that time, I thought, I know I don't want my kid to have the dad I had, and this is what it's going to look like. And that's foolish a little bit, that, or a little overconfident that like it's just going to work out. It'll just be that way. And that wasn't the case. And we had a second son who was 3 months premature. He weighed 1 pound, 10 ounces, and just it was the scariest thing ever. It also had a toll on us even after his birth, even though he was healthy. And it was terrifying, and it stressed us. And for lots of different reasons, that marriage was not going to work. And I was also wrapping up my master's degree May, June of that same year. So I'm getting divorced. I'm back at mom and dad's house. I am finishing up my master's, starting my PsyD program. And in November, which is deer hunting season, if you don't know, but November 12th of 2006, my father made the decision to end his life during a hunting trip. And he put a shotgun to his chest, and he pulled the trigger. And, you know, the rest of my life was forever changed. It's you know, I know that's kind of just a simplified statement, but the person that existed on November 11, 2006 ended. That person no longer exists. And I know that there are many parts that make us up as human beings, but it changed me in a forever way. It was the first time since I was a child that I felt a lack of control, and that I could not stop crying. I couldn't control my emotions, obviously, and this is torture. And I felt like I got no answer. I felt like there was no response. So when he was finally gone, not only was I angry with God, I was also struggling with guilt. Isn't this what you wanted? You wanted it to be over. You wanted it to be real. So in some sick way, I almost felt like I caused this, or I felt bad that there was some relief. It's over now. And even though I didn't want it to be over, this was final, and we would never have to carry that same stress, and that felt wrong and that felt awful. And I tried to practice what I preach. I got back into therapy. I'd been out a few years. I got back into therapy, but I only did it for 2, 3 months, and I thought, okay, I'm fine now. I really didn't understand grief. I didn't understand the power of grief, and I started to pour myself into that career. That's what mattered to me, was the awards, the plaques, the recognition, and I poured myself into that career. I got to see my kids every other weekend. This career loves me. This career recognizes the effort that I put in, and it was a distraction from what was really going on inside of me, and that was never going to be enough. When I started that career, I wanted to be a police officer. And while I was training to get on a department, I injured my back. I herniated 2 discs in 2001. So they sent me to pain management and put me on pain pills. And for, I don't know, 6 years, I took them exactly the way they were prescribed. It was what it was. Took them like I do my blood pressure pill. And I remember the first time I ever took more. I remember it. It was the first U of L UK game, which is the in-state rivalry here, and it was the first U of L UK football game. And since he died, and I wasn't having fun. I wasn't enjoying it. I was with my uncle. I should have been, but all I was aware of is that my dad's not here, and you know, had my bag with me, clothes, which means I brought my medication. And for some reason, I walked in there and I took an extra pain pill. And you know what? I felt good. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I felt euphoric. And it's seemingly the answer to, I wouldn't say prayer, but to complaints. And my story is no different than anybody else's. One's too many and a thousand's never enough, is what they say in 12-step circles. And it doesn't really matter what the substance is, what it looks like. It all ends up in the same places. But all that education and growing up in a dysfunctional family, I'm resilient. I was able to function as an addict for a few years before it really manifested into something different. And it was OxyContin that really changed everything. Couldn't find any pain medication, and someone had one, and the sickness that I experienced, I don't even know how to describe to someone. I guess maybe the worst flu you've ever had, and someone says, if you swallow this, it goes away in 5 minutes. I think we've all been sick enough that, like, yeah, I want this to end. Except this is synthetic heroin. That's what that was. It should have never been on the market for the mass public. It was absolutely a travesty in this country. Regular pain pills wouldn't work after that, and these things were $1 a milligram, and the minimal pill was 80 milligrams. It was a very expensive habit. And in the end of my active use, I was at about 5 of those a day. So doing the math, like, you can't sustain that. All of my income went towards it. I started to use the credit cards for the correctional facility that I operated to buy cartons of cigarettes and sell them so that I could come up with the money to not be sick, basically. Wasn't even getting high at that point. I was just trying not to be sick. And, that comes with consequences. That active addiction and those decisions that I made, they caught up to me. It cost me that career. Shortly thereafter, the detectives were calling, and it was, this is crazy. I haven't done anything. I'd love to just say that, like, that was the awakening for me. And it was like, this ain't who I am. I'm hard-headed, and sometimes I really do learn the hard way. But being arraigned in a courtroom is what really changed everything for me. The shame of that, and how did I get to this point? Like, how did this happen? Was enough for me to fight back for my life. And I entered into sobriety on September 7th, 2010. And I detoxed for 27 days. I don't care what you read in the book. I don't care what anyone tells you. Pain pills. This was synthetic heroin. I was sick, for physically ill for 27 days. And that was by my own doing. Don't get me wrong. But what happened is that I fought and fought and fought, because some of the things that they charged me with, I didn't do that. I've told you I've done this. I was basically told, we throw it at the wall, see what sticks, and it's on you to prove different. That system that I worked in, I found I didn't work the way that I thought it did. It is, and I'm not here to really bash the criminal justice system, but it was a tough lesson to learn. And for 18 months, I fought back against that and ultimately decided to take a plea bargain to some lesser charges, and they were not going to oppose probation. And even if I didn't get it, I was parole eligible with my jail credit time. I hadn't seen my children in all that time, so it was like, this is the best decision. You sign that deal, you come back 6 weeks later just to be told you're being remanded to the Department of Corrections. And I went to prison. My addiction sent me to prison. My actions sent me to prison, and it was surreal. We don't have enough time to talk about what that walk through those tunnels to get from the courthouse to the jail were like, but it was a long walk. However, it saved my life. It absolutely, even though a sober man had to pay the price for an intoxicated person, I was still sick. I was just sober. I wasn't healing. I wasn't working on my grief. I wasn't working on anything. And it actually ended up saving my life. But what's important about that journey is this. Immediately, my mother started trying to minister to me. You need to pray. I don't know how to pray, Mom. I know a lot of prayers, but either God's not real or he doesn't love me. That was really what I had come to believe. Like, one of these two things has to be true. Where's he at? I remember having some drunken crow's nest arguments, like Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump. Like, where you at? Come on down here. Prove yourself to me. I remember saying those words, and I felt like I heard nothing. I invoked this. I asked him to prove himself to me. And I have to remember that means that I prayed for the problems that I had in my life. Now, again, it was my actions and my mistakes that led me to that point. But I thought all those things on the wall were important. I keep referencing the wall like this is my office, but it was, I had to be stripped of all control, all illusions of control, to really sit still and see what was going on inside my heart, inside my mind, my soul. And as my mother's minister trying to get me to pray, I remember saying that, like, I know a bunch of prayers. They teach all kinds of them in the Catholic Church, but they're song lyrics to me. They don't mean anything, and I don't think there's anybody on the other end answering. And they came through one day and hollered church. And this guy I'm telling jokes with, we're just kind of talking and chatting, trying to make the best of a really messed up situation. Gets up to leave the dorm. And I'm like, where are you going? He goes, church. Why? We have nothing better to do. Those were his words. And I got up and went with him because he was not wrong. We had nothing better to do. That was why I went to church. And there was a volunteer from a local church that came in. And I'll be honest, for 20, 30 minutes, all I could think of was how unsafe it looked in there. I came from this employment background. There's 20, 30 of us and one officer and a volunteer. This is not safe. What if something happens? I'm not paying attention, but all of a sudden I hear this man preaching out of Matthew 6, that this is how you pray. Our Father, who art in heaven. And I love to tell you that the light bulb came on and that was the moment. But that's in hindsight. I can actually recall what happened there. I went back, I got transferred a few days later, and I went to somewhere that was not very pleasant. And I started going to NA meetings there. And it was a pastor from the neighboring state that came in and ran NA AA groups and church. And he kept telling me, like, hey, man, you seem to get this recovery stuff. Like, what did you used to do outside here? And I'm like, I can't talk about it. I worked for whatever, made something up. I did not want anyone to know what I did for a living. That would have been a safety issue. And yeah, I was serious about staying clean in my recovery, but I kept turning him down to go to church. No, no, that ain't my thing. I'm not going. And finally, my my grandfather was ill. And that's really who was my father figure growing up. My grandfather was the male figure in my life that raised me, and he was ill. So I'm now struggling with the guilt of he's been there for me for everything in my life, and I can't be there for him. And I'm also afraid of losing him and the fact that I'm never going to get over that if I'm here. But there's zero I can do about it. Absolutely nothing I can do or say is going to make this right. And I remember sitting on a concrete floor on the phone with my mother one day, and I was like, I did every bit of this. This is all my fault. Because up until that point, it was those crooked detectives, it was my ex-wife, it was my roommate, it was the doctors that prescribed me this stuff in the first place. It was everyone's fault but my own. Where were they? Not where I was. My actions sent me where I was sent. And I had to come to terms with that my two sons hadn't seen me or really been able to talk to me. And I was like, you can't fix this. How do you fix this? I've ruined my entire life. And I remember my mother saying, you're going to have to forgive yourself. And I told her, how? How could I possibly forgive myself for doing these things, for hurting my children like this? And, I started to go to church there, and I started to get in my Bible. And something happened. It was not a book anymore. Things were jumping out at me. Things were making sense that I had just read over and over again growing up, but they were just words in a book. They weren't a living, breathing embodiment of Christ. It was just words. But now they're coming off the page. Now they're connecting dots. And, don't get me wrong, it wasn't like this massively supernatural experience, but it was enough to keep, what was that about? What is going on? I also had a lot of free time. So don't get me wrong. The Bible and James Patterson kept me alive, a lot of that. But my grandfather was approaching a surgery that he may or may not survive. And it was just too much. I was tired. I have lived through and carried so much in my life, and now all I'm carrying is shame and guilt, and I couldn't do it anymore. For the first time in my life, I was like, I'm not strong enough to do this. I'm not. And you could have never convinced me before that I wasn't strong enough to do anything. Church was on Saturday, and I would see guys stand up every week and get saved, and they'd go back to a dorm and do God knows what. And they were hypocrites. And I would argue we're all hypocrites at this point. But I grew up in a church that there was a running joke that you can do whatever you want. You just have to say you're sorry later, which is not how I think this works. But I digress. So I didn't want to be a hypocrite anymore. I didn't want to be lukewarm. I didn't want to be the guy that I was before. And I knew if I'll go to church every Sunday. I'm not going to church every Sunday. Lord, I know better, and I believe that you know what's in my heart, and I'm not. It's not possible. I'm not going to. I promised I'll go one time. I'll give you one time outside these walls, Lord. But that Saturday night, his surgery was on a Wednesday, but that Saturday night when church happened, I stood up and accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And this was in 2012, in July. And 3 days later, they released me. They came in on a Tuesday unannounced and released me on a 5-year sentence. Well, and I apologize, I skipped over, but when I got there for final sentencing, they said 0 jail credit. That was not the deal. I was upset. There's nothing you can do about it. So I'm starting from day one. I'm no longer parole eligible. I don't know when I'm going to get out of here. It was It was a God thing in the end because I wasn't supposed to be released. What happened is it was my 90th day in custody, and my judge shocked me out. We have something here called shock probation, and it truly means we're going to give you an experience and show you what your life's going to look like, and hopefully shock you and give you a chance to prove that's not you. But you get one shot at that. After that, you're what they say you are. You're what the paperwork says you are. And my uncle came and got me. We drove all night, and I was there for that surgery on Wednesday. And every day, I had to go to work immediately. I've got to go see a probation officer. I've got money I owe this. I got to pay back all the stuff that I've done, rightfully so. But like, I have real world stress week after week. I haven't went to church, and I drive past the church I grew up in every day. But see, I know what's in there. Nothing, nothing for me. And it might sound strange, but that was the one thing that was maybe in the back of my mind keeping me on the straight and narrow, that I owe this debt. And it was being backburnered to responsibilities and work. But I met my wife, and one of the things but we went on what was a non-date, is what we called it, and we sat at a Chili's and we put all our dirty laundry on the table. And I think we were trying to scare one another, but we were both kind of like, I don't know what this is, but it feels real. It was kind of refreshing, to be honest with you. We didn't send our best representative to, hey, I'm perfect. It was like, I've got some problems. And she went to church every Sunday, and no one told her to. No one called and reminded her. It was the strangest thing. She'd turn off TV to get ready to go, and I had to go to work. And she would invite me every week, but what was my legitimate excuse became something I couldn't get around anymore, because my car broke down one weekend, and I was delivering sandwiches at a Jimmy John's, and I couldn't go to work. So I made Kool-Aid jokes the whole way to church. I was, I don't know about this, at least it's in a real church, because it was in an old Catholic church that had been turned into a different church, Baptist church. But we get there, and there's blue jeans and flannel, and I'm like, what have they done in the Lord's house? There's coffee pots in the vestibule. Like, what? And we go sit in this balcony, and this little guy comes. He's not little, but he comes bebopping down the aisle with a little earpiece. I'm like, who's this guy? She's like, that's Pastor Daniel Montgomery. As if I know who this man is, right? And I don't know what he was preaching out of, but I know that in the middle of his sermon, he started talking about struggling with his faith. And I was like, he can't say that. He's a pastor. And immediately he followed with, and I know what you're thinking. I can't say that because I'm a pastor. And I was like, what is going on here? And she's having a normal Sunday. I just encountered the Holy Spirit. I just witnessed honesty for the first time inside of a church. Someone admitting that they don't have it all together and that they struggle. And something shifted again. And it kind of anchored all of those experiences. It was real. I met the Holy Spirit. I met a living God. All of it was real. And while Jesus is the linchpin of my faith, I am in covenant with this woman over this. We got married 1 year to the day that we met, which by many people's standards was probably very fast. And I knew we were not going to have it all together. I knew it was going to be tough, but it was like, I basically know the worst that there is about her. She accepts me as I am. And I can't shake this God thing. And that woman saw things in me that I didn't believe in myself anymore.
Is that reminds me, bless your heart. That reminds me of my husband and I, but also the scripture that talks about, and I may be taking it out of context, but how the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the believing husband, or vice versa. Kind of like her walk won you over, or her unconditional love
Yeah,
won you over.
I can remember, one Sunday, like, I was having a conversation with a guy I grew up with that week before. I mean, it's the guy that's still not living right, maybe, and uh, I'm sharing faith with him, and he's like, "What is that about?" But in a realistic way, not with a bullhorn on the corner. From a guy that has been there and done that and understands. And I remember qualifying when I was talking to her, like, I mean, I'm not a pastor, like that'll never be me. And she goes, "It could be. That could be you." I was like, no. Um, we had we found out we were pregnant 3 months after we got married and started our family. As he was born, my older two sons were reconciled into this family. And I thought I was being called to seminary. So I enroll. We find out we're having a kid. I went to grad school with my older kid. I'm not doing that. So I backed out, waited a couple years, um, and re-enrolled different seminary online. Another kid on the way, fourth son. And I'm like, God, I don't understand. I feel like you're calling me to do this, but you're putting me in an impossible situation that I have to make this choice. And as that went, became me wrestling with what I was actually being called to do. And I can remember I was miserable at a job. I was selling cars. Nobody wanted to give me a chance. I had to take whatever I could. And I hated it. It was terrible. I was a terrible car salesman. You got a lot of people, and it was not in line with what I believed anymore. But I remember seeing online that this guy's best friend had shot and killed, or I'm sorry, he had not died. And he was clinging to life. And all day I was sick to my stomach that, like, I know what it's like to be in those waiting rooms. I can't fix this. And it was like, go down there and be with him. And I was like, what? No, I don't do death. I don't do dead bodies. I don't go to funerals. I don't do hospitals. It will trigger my PTSD. I can't go. I can't, God. Like, this is not something I'm capable of doing. I'm not your Job. I'm not your Moses. Like, don't call me to do something I can't do. And I wrestled all day back and forth. It was like, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. So at the end of the day, I went down to the hospital and I prayed with that guy. He took me in to see his friend. I prayed over him, and he passed a couple of days later, I believe. I wish that wasn't the case, but I wasn't triggered. It didn't bring nightmares. It didn't bring anything up. That was 2016. And I started meeting with a spiritual formation pastor at my church. I thought I was going crazy. I was like, God's telling me to go do these things, and I'm not qualified for this. I don't know what to do. And he's like, I'll meet with you. And for 2 years, we met every week over coffee and did eldership training. And he walked with me hand in hand as God put this calling on my life. And for 3 years, it was sick calls and hospital visits for people. I can't fix this, but I'll sit with them while you go eat. Have you ate? Can I bring you food? Can I pray over you guys? Sometimes they didn't want me to bring up faith, and that's fine too. I don't have to. And I never once had an adverse experience, anything that triggered my stuff. And in 2019, I was asked to do a funeral, and I said yes before I realized I don't know anything about doing a funeral, and I didn't go to seminary. And I remember sharing that with my pastor, and he goes, "They don't teach you how to do that in seminary." And I'm like, "What do you guys learn?" Oh, but he sent me some templates. All I've ever wanted to do was be a writer, and my background in psychology and writing and all this stuff just came together. And I was able to manage the family drama that always comes out in a funeral. I was able to honor their loved one and show up in a loving presence with them in a funeral home that did not trigger me. This is what it means in Philippians to say that I can accomplish all things through Christ who strengthens me. It doesn't mean I'm going to win the World Series. It means he can make the impossible possible. I can't do that. I can't. Richard Lynch's afraid of death and dead bodies. But with the Spirit, with Christ in me, I'm able to be his hands and feet and show up and carry that with people. I don't know why this has been my journey, but I know that I never feel more whole or complete than when I do a funeral for a family. Um, I've done 118 at this point, and I don't know why I even keep up with the number at this point. I think some of it's still maybe disbelief. Once in a while, I'll get those old messages that, how is this me?
Yeah.
But that's been what my journey has looked like. I'm a professional counselor again. I work in the field of corrections again. I not only have gotten a second chance in life, God has restored and then some in my life. And I know that might not be everyone's walk and everyone's experience, but for some reason, I was only there 3 months. I learned what I needed to learn, both for my own life and for this system. And I'm able to take that. And while I can't operate as a minister in this secular environment, they know my faith, and that's enough. And they can't tell me you've not been there, you don't get it. I do, guys, I do. And I can't fix anything for any of them either. I recognize that. It's about walking with people, sharing your experience, and then obviously the professional counseling end of it is a little bit more involved. But I realize like I can only do so much. But if I teach the next generation of counselors, how many people can they reach? How many can we reach together? And that's where I've found myself in life and the direction of it. And it feels like a movie sometimes. It feels like I'm maybe dreaming at times that I've been. And listen, coming to faith hasn't made things easier in my life. It has increased the difficulty. I have had to say more times than not, do not test me like that. I'm not your Job. And I have had to walk through every one of those scenarios in faith. And I have gotten through it. And I have been able to come out the other side. And it's hurt and it sucked. And it's a permanent part of this journey on earth as a human being. But I've been able to navigate and survive all the things that have been meant to destroy me and kill me. And I have 14 years of sobriety. I have 5 beautiful, healthy children. I ended up with custody of those 2 older boys. I finally retired after having a daughter. And, while they might all be a little jealous of the me that she gets, they should also thank her because she started to shift my heart in a different way, in a softer way, to realize that like that was really when the journey began in 2019 of realizing like there's a men's mental health crisis in this country because we teach young men to not have feelings. We tell them from the time they're this big to dry it up. You better quit crying. I'll give you something to cry about. You better rub some dirt in it and keep going. You're a sissy. And those scars stick. What I skipped over was I was with someone when my dad passed and I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't control these things. And I remember laying there trying to sleep and dealing with this and cut it out. Oh my God, everyone's parents die. You need to get over this. And I tell you what I did. I stopped crying for 8 years. For 8 years, I didn't cry because it was not safe. It was not welcome. And it was not a healthy thing to do. I'm not bragging about it. It took a lot of undoing, as you just saw. Like I don't have an issue crying at this point. We wouldn't have that ability if God didn't want us to have it. And it's actually a soothing thing. Chemicals get released that are good for us. So that's enough science. I also got out of that relationship very quickly after that. But, I know that there are people still struggling. I know that people are still dealing with things from their childhood and life. And really that has kind of become the shift in my mission is to, that's the name of the ministry that I operate as a volunteer is spread the word. Like I do funerals for people that don't have a pastor, the people that have overdosed or committed suicide and the family didn't have plans in place and they're struggling. It's like, I can take that off your plate. They deserve to be honored. Their life mattered and let me help you do that. And, you know, there have been times where I thought maybe that is what I'm supposed to be doing vocationally. But see, that's the part of discernment and God's calling in your life is the way we imagine it might not always be the way that He intends it. And we just have to be wise and trust. And the only thing I've done in all this was be obedient. That is it. I have fought back against my own excuses and the lies that I hear from the enemy that I can't do this or I'm not qualified for that. Well, God doesn't call the equipped; He equips the yeah,
Eclipse the called. Eclipse the
yes.
called.
I was like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
um, yeah, like truly and figuratively, that is exactly what He did with me, and I always wanted to be a writer, so I've wrote my first book and working on finding a home for it. I have, I've done a lot of podcast visits to share my message. I mentioned, like, depends on the subject. Sometimes it's as a professional talking about mental health issues. Sometimes I did one about parents that have kids with mental health issues because my older two sons are both bipolar. Um, I Sometimes it's faith. You know, it's the same message my life is, but I can share it in different ways. And what I realized though is that if I ever really want to have the conversations about the things that I want to have conversations about, I'm going to have to do it myself. So I've also had a podcast in development for a little while called Lean on Your People, and it's to talk about the difficult things that we all go through, but we keep quiet, suffer in silence, whether it's addiction, mental health, grief, trauma, abuse, all of it. There are a lot of survivors out there, and the way that we get through that is to lean on the people around us. This is a team sport, and we don't always feel that, but there are people that are out here willing to walk with a stranger if you don't have people. And I want to foster that kind of community. I want to foster that kind of a belief system where it's like we're going to help you get through this, whatever that looks like. Because that's what happened to me. If it weren't for support, if there wasn't some people that didn't give up on me when I was at rock bottom, I could have never heard God's voice. I probably never would have heard it, to be honest. I would have disregarded it because as I thought, I asked Him to prove His existence, and He didn't. He absolutely did. And the other thing that I realized is He had been there all along. All these horrible things that I had been through in my life, He was there. He treaded water with me. He kept me afloat. He put people in my path to help me cling to another 2 weeks, to another month, to another season. And not all of those people were still around. They were teachers. They were, other people's family members, my friends' family members. They became my surrogate family at times. Like, it's my grandpa, you know? So I know that there's a lot of suffering in the world. And I just want to spread a message of hope that, like, we can get through this. Like, you don't have to do this alone.
That's right. And even I believe they say in NA the therapeutic value of one addict helping another is without parallel.
Hmm.
But we definitely need community, and God does send people our way, even when you think that there's nobody, or if you maybe don't have the traditional family, or you're not even in a church. There's somebody. I've had complete strangers. God used complete strangers to talk to me.
That's right.
But we're coming to a close. There was one scripture and I wish I could remember it because it's one of my favorites. I know it's in the Psalms and I want to say 117, but I'll just mess that up. But it says, "This is the Lord's doing and it is marvelous in our eyes." And that's what I think about when you tell your story, is that you, like you say, all you did was be obedient, and everything else was all God. God
That's right.
really showed Himself to you in a mighty way, and now look at you, um, being the hands and feet of Jesus and serving some of the most neglected people in our society. And so, God bless you for that, and God bless you for coming on today and sharing your story and being so open.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm vulnerable. I appreciate that. Do you have, um, now you mentioned the book is okay, so the book's not out yet?
It's not out yet. I am still shopping for a home for it before I give up and go the self-publishing route. But
Right, right.
um, had to do a little bit of revision to remarket it, but
Yeah.
uh,
And
it's
then
coming.
I believe that for you. And then the podcast, is it up and running yet?
It is not. It is in development. We've finally found a location, so I have a cousin that's going to co-host it with me who lives with bipolar disorder. So we bring some, multiple perspectives to these conversations.
That'll be great. And just, yeah, you've got my information. When you get that started, hit me up, and I'll be glad to help in any way I can. If you're looking for a guest at any time, I've also been on other shows
I
sharing
love.
my story. So mine's similar to yours. Like you say, we think that we're unique, but really I've ran into so many people doing this show with similar stories and situations as me. So, oh, and finally though, do you have any websites or anything that you want
Yeah.
to share before we close?
Um, right now, I'm trying to grow my platform through social media. That was some of the feedback I've gotten from some agents and publishing houses to grow. You have to apparently help sell books these days. So, okay, they're the expert in that field. So you could find me on TikTok at Lean on Your People, um, Facebook, Richard Lynch, or Instagram, aka Gator Lee, which is my pen name, what I will write under. My childhood nickname is Gator, and Lee is my middle name, and there's a whole story to that. So, gives a little separation between my personal life and my professional career. So, that's where you can find me right now.
All right. And if anybody has missed any of the information, as you all know, or if you're new listening, I always put updates and guest information on my Facebook page. It's called the Grit and Grace Podcast page. Just go on Facebook pages and search for the Grit and Grace Podcast. There are some others with the same name, so just look for the Paisley logo. And just make sure to like or follow the page. That way you can get the updates and get information on Richard if you missed it. Richard, thanks so much again for coming on. And it is time for us to close out. Thank you so much for listening
Thank
to
you.
the Grit and Grace podcast. You all be blessed in Jesus' name. Bye bye. Thank you for watching the Grit and Grace podcast. Don't forget to follow me on social media on Facebook at the Grit and Grace podcast, TikTok, and Instagram. I've always provide all my updates on my social platforms, and I look forward to seeing you there. Again, be blessed in Jesus' name, and pray for me as I continue to pray for you. Thanks again for watching the Grit and Grace podcast. Bye-bye.